The diner buzzed with the hum of clinking silverware, muffled laughter, and the low drone of a jukebox tucked in the corner, crooning an old blues tune. Neon lights from the sign outside cast a warm but uneven glow through the large, grease-smeared windows, streaking the vinyl booths in hues of pink and yellow. The air was thick with the mingling scents of fried food, syrup, and burnt coffee, a comforting aroma for most, but not for the man seated in the corner booth, furthest from the counter. Isaiah Johnson, a broad-shouldered man with a body shaped by years of discipline and more recent years of self-neglect, sat alone, his frame almost dwarfing the booth. His dark skin seemed to absorb the diner's artificial glow, and his weathered leather jacket bore the weight of its own stories, creases, and scuffs whispering of days spent in sand, sweat, and danger. His thick hands, calloused but steady, cupped a chipped coffee mug, the steam curling up into his face like a ghost of comfort. He stared at the table, not drinking, not eating, just staring, as though waiting for something he couldn't quite name. The waitress had been kind enough, though her smiles were tight and quick, her eyes darting nervously toward the center of the room, where a table of men had been watching Isaiah since he walked in. The group, 4 of them, dressed in leather jackets adorned with symbols Isaiah recognized from his small-town upbringing, spoke in low tones, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. Every so often, one of them would turn to look at him, their expressions thinly veiled with contempt. Isaiah felt the weight of their gazes, like a familiar itch he couldn't scratch. He had grown used to this over the years, this silent hostility that hung in the air like second-hand smoke in spaces he dared to occupy, but that didn't mean he liked it. As a former Marine, he'd fought for this country, bled for it, yet here he was, back in civilian life, still fighting, though in subtler ways. The battlefield had changed, but the war hadn't. The diner's bell jingled as the front door opened, letting in a burst of cold wind. Isaiah's eyes flicked up, meeting the reflection of the newcomers in the mirror behind the counter. A couple, young and carefree, laughing as they found a seat by the window, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension rippling through the room. He envied their innocence, their freedom to exist without feeling like an unwelcome guest in their own home. "Hey, you gonna drink that coffee or just stare at it all night?" The voice was sharp, cutting through the ambient noise like a knife. Isaiah turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto the speaker. It was one of the men from the center table, a wiry guy with a shaved head and a smirk that didn't quite reach his cold blue eyes. His friends chuckled, leaning back in their chairs as if settling in for a show. Isaiah didn't respond. He returned his gaze to his coffee, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. He knew better than to take the bait. In places like this, with people like them, silence was often the best armor. "Hey, I'm talking to you, big guy," the man persisted, standing now, his boots clunking heavily against the tiled floor as he approached Isaiah's booth. The diner seemed to grow quieter, the normal chatter fading into a muted hum. Even the waitress froze mid-step, her tray trembling in her hands. Isaiah's grip on the coffee mug tightened, the muscles in his forearm rippling beneath the sleeve of his jacket. He could feel the old instincts kicking in, the heightened awareness of his surroundings, the adrenaline beginning to trickle into his veins. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in years, not since he'd left the Corps. The man stopped a few feet from Isaiah's booth, his smirk widening as he crossed his arms. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you just don't know how to talk to people like us?" His words dripped with venom, each syllable laced with the kind of hatred Isaiah had encountered more times than he cared to count. Isaiah lifted his eyes, meeting the man's gaze with a steady calm that only years of discipline could muster. For a moment the man faltered, his smirk wavering, as if he'd seen something in Isaiah's expression he hadn't expected. But the moment passed quickly, and the man recovered, leaning closer. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low but no less menacing. So why don't you finish up and move along? Wouldn't want any trouble now, would we? Isaiah didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply sat there, his silence speaking louder than any words could. The man straightened, his frustration evident as he glanced back at his friends for encouragement. They laughed, egging him on, and the tension in the room grew heavier, like a storm cloud ready to burst. The waitress took a hesitant step forward, her voice trembling as she tried to diffuse the situation. "Hey, why don't we all just calm down, huh? Let the man enjoy his coffee in peace." But her words fell on deaf ears. The man's attention was solely focused on Isaiah now, his pride demanding satisfaction. He reached out, his hand hovering over the edge of the table as if to grab Isaiah's mug, or maybe Isaiah himself. In that split second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Isaiah's hand moved, not in panic, but with purpose. He placed the mug down carefully, deliberately, before straightening to his full height. As he rose, the booth creaked under his weight, and the man stepped back instinctively, his bravado faltering. Isaiah towered over him now, his presence commanding, his eyes cold and unyielding. For the first time that night, the diner was completely silent. Even the jukebox had stopped, leaving nothing but the sound of Isaiah's slow, steady breathing. He spoke then, his voice low and firm, carrying the weight of years spent leading men through chaos and danger. "You really don't want to do this," he said, each word measured and deliberate. The man hesitated, his confidence clearly shaken. But his friends were watching, and their laughter echoed in his ears like a dare he couldn't refuse. And then, as if on cue, the storm broke. The man lunged forward, his hand swinging toward Isaiah in a reckless arc. But Isaiah was faster, much faster than anyone in that diner could have anticipated. The scene froze for a heartbeat, the tension snapping like a rubber band pulled too. Tight. And then everything erupted. The man's lunge seemed to stretch time itself, the reckless swing of his hand moving in slow motion as Isaiah's instincts kicked in. His marine training, a mix of precision, discipline and survival instinct, took over as naturally as breathing. With a single step to the side and a fluid twist of his wrist, Isaiah intercepted the man's arm, twisting it just enough to halt, his movement without causing permanent harm. The man yelped, his bravado evaporating in an instant, and Isaiah let go, stepping back as the diner collectively exhaled. The group at the center table shifted uneasily, their laughter and jeers replaced by uncertain glances. The waitress set her tray down with trembling hands, her gaze darting between Isaiah and the man who now cradled his arm, red-faced and furious. For a moment, the only sound was the distant roar of a passing truck outside. Isaiah turned back to his booth, sitting down as if nothing had happened. He picked up his mug, his large fingers cradling the ceramic like a lifeline. "I told you," he said quietly, his voice steady and calm. "You didn't want to do that." The man muttered something under his breath, but he didn't approach. Again. Instead, he slinked back to his table, his friends whispering hurried words that Isaiah couldn't hear. He didn't need to. He'd seen this before, countless times, the bravado of bullies crumbling under the weight of consequences they hadn't anticipated. Isaiah took a sip of his now lukewarm coffee, his gaze drifting to the diner's window. The glass reflected his own face back at him, weathered and worn, with eyes that carried too many memories. His mind wandered back to a different time, a different place. It had been nearly a decade since Isaiah had left the Marine Corps, but some days it felt like yesterday. The desert heat, the smell of sweat and gunpowder, the endless cacophony of shouted orders and explosions, it all lingered in his mind like a scar that refused to fade. He'd enlisted at 18, eager to escape the small-town life that seemed to offer him nothing but dead-end jobs and empty promises. His mother, a sharp-tongued but loving woman who'd raised him on her own, had cried when he told her. "Isaiah, baby," she'd said, her hands gripping his like she was afraid he might vanish right there in the kitchen. "Promise me you'll come back whole. I can't lose you too." He had promised, and he'd kept that promise, at least physically. But the man who returned from deployment wasn't the same one who'd left. The war had stripped him of his youthful optimism, replacing it with a grim understanding of the world's darker truths. He'd seen good men fall, seen hatred take on 1,000 forms, seen courage tested and broken, and when he finally came home, he found that the battles didn't end. They just changed shape. The bell above the diner's door jingled again, jolting Isaiah back to the present. A heavy-set man in a sheriff's uniform stepped inside, his boots scuffing the tiled floor as he surveyed the room. Sheriff Reed was a fixture in this town, a man whose presence often brought a mix of relief and tension, depending on which side of the law you stood on. Reed's eyes landed on the group at the center table, lingering just long enough to send a message. Then he looked over at Isaiah and gave a slight nod. Isaiah returned it, appreciating the subtle acknowledgement. The sheriff might not have been a friend, but he wasn't an enemy either. Not yet, at least. Reed approached the counter, ordering a coffee to go. As he waited, he leaned against the counter, his gaze occasionally drifting toward Isaiah. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't entirely neutral either. Isaiah could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Why are you here? What's your story? Are you trouble? Isaiah wasn't a stranger to those questions, though they were rarely voiced outright. In towns like this, his presence alone was enough to spark curiosity, suspicion, or worse. He didn't look like he belonged, and in a way he didn't, but he wasn't here by choice. After leaving the Corps, Isaiah had tried to build a life in the city. He'd worked security jobs, enrolled in night classes, even joined a support group for veterans. But the weight of everything he'd seen and done made it hard to connect with people. He carried a sense of isolation with him like a shadow, always there, always heavy. When his mother's health began to decline, he'd returned to the small town he once couldn't wait to escape. She needed him, and despite everything, he couldn't turn his back on her. But coming back meant facing the ghosts of his past, the stares, the whispers, the quiet reminders that he was still an outsider in a place that never felt like home. Now, with his mother gone and nothing tying him here but a rundown house on the edge of town, Isaiah was simply existing. He worked odd jobs, kept to himself, and tried to avoid trouble. But trouble had a way of finding him, even in the most mundane places. The sheriff collected his coffee and left, the bell jingling again as the door swung shut. The group at the center table had grown quieter, their earlier bravado replaced by uneasy murmurs. One of them, a younger man with a scruffy beard, kept glancing at Isaiah, his expression a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The waitress approached Isaiah's booth cautiously, her voice soft as she asked, "You need anything else, hon? Maybe a refill?" Isaiah looked up at her, offering a faint smile. "I'm good, thanks." She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the group in the middle of the room. "You let me know if you need anything, okay?" He nodded, appreciating her attempt at kindness, even if it came with its own layer of fear. As she walked away, Isaiah's attention was drawn back to the window. Outside, the sky had darkened, the neon sign casting long shadows on the cracked asphalt. He watched as a pickup truck pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the gloom. The truck idled for a moment before the engine cut off, and two men stepped out. They weren't from the diner, and they weren't locals. Isaiah could tell from the way they moved, their postures tense, their faces shadowed beneath the brims of their hats. One of them reached into the truck's cab, pulling out something long and slender, a crowbar, or maybe a tire iron. Isaiah's stomach tightened. He didn't need to guess why they were here. He could feel the storm brewing, the air thick with the promise of violence. Inside the diner, the group at the center table noticed the newcomers, their murmurs growing louder. The man Isaiah had disarmed earlier sat up straighter, his chest puffing out like he was ready to prove himself again. Isaiah leaned back in his booth, his mind already running through the possibilities. He didn't want this fight, didn't ask for it. But if it came to him, he knew he'd be ready. The door opened, the bell ringing once more as the two men entered. Their eyes scanned the room, landing on Isaiah with a predatory focus that sent a chill through the diner. The waitress froze mid-step, her face pale as she looked between them. "And Isaiah!" And then one of the men spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "We heard there's someone here who doesn't know his place." The room fell silent again, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Isaiah didn't move, his expression unreadable as he met the man's gaze. The storm wasn't coming anymore. It was already here. The diner grew colder, though the door was shut tightly behind the two new arrivals. They moved with the confidence of men who expected others to fear them, their boots heavy on the worn tiles as they crossed the room. One was tall and broad, his shoulders straining against his flannel shirt, the crowbar dangling loosely from his right hand. The other was wiry and sharp-featured, his thin lips twisted into a smirk that matched the gleam in his eyes. Isaiah didn't flinch. He sat still, his large hands resting on the table in front of him, fingers relaxed but ready. His gaze didn't waver as the taller man stopped a few feet away, tapping the crowbar against his open palm like a promise. "Looks like you've been making friends," the taller man said, his voice deep and gravelly, carrying a faint southern drawl. His eyes swept over Isaiah, taking in his size, his composure, and finally the quiet authority that seemed to radiate from him. Isaiah didn't respond. His silence was deliberate, a strategy he'd perfected over the years. Words could escalate. A situation faster than fists, and he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of losing his calm. The wiry man stepped closer, his smirk widening. "You don't talk much, huh? That's fine. We just came to have a little chat, make sure you understand how things work around here." The group from the center table watched eagerly, their earlier discomfort replaced by a sick anticipation. The man Isaiah had disarmed earlier leaned forward, his bruised ego clearly hungry for redemption. Isaiah let out a slow breath, his eyes flicking between the two men. The taller one was the obvious threat, but the wiry one was dangerous in a different way. He had the look of someone who enjoyed pushing buttons, manipulating situations until they boiled over. "I don't want any trouble," Isaiah said finally, his voice low but firm. "Trouble?" The wiry man laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant. "We're not trouble. We're just reminders. People like you need to be reminded every now and then where you stand." The crowbar tapped against the floor, a hollow metallic sound that echoed in the tense silence. Isaiah felt his pulse quicken, the familiar rush of adrenaline creeping in. He hated that feeling, hated the memories it brought with it. He was. Back in the desert, the heat so intense it felt like it was baking his skin. The air smelled of sand and smoke, and the distant sound of gunfire punctuated the stillness. Isaiah crouched behind a crumbling wall, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. Around him, his unit moved with quiet efficiency, their voices coming through his earpiece in clipped, controlled tones. "Stay calm, Johnson," his sergeant had said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "You're trained for this. Trust yourself." It had been his first real firefight, and the fear had been almost overwhelming. But those words, simple, practical, and unshakable, had grounded him. He'd taken a deep breath, steadied his hands, and done what needed to be done. Those words had stayed with him long after the war. Stay calm. Trust yourself. Isaiah blinked, bringing himself back to the present. The wiry man had moved closer, his smirk fading as he realized Isaiah wasn't reacting the way he'd hoped. "You're awful quiet for someone who thinks he can just walk into our town and act like he belongs here," the man said, his tone sharpening. You think you're better than us? Huh? Isaiah shook his head slowly. I don't think I'm better than anyone. I'm just here to have my coffee and mind my business. Your business is our business, the taller man cut in, his grip on the crowbar tightening. And we don't take kindly to outsiders who think they can ignore the rules. Isaiah leaned back slightly, his expression calm but unreadable. What rules are those? The taller man took a step closer, looming over Isaiah now. The crowbar swung idly at his side, but the threat was clear. Rule number 1, know your place. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. The waitress had disappeared into the kitchen, and the few other patrons in the diner sat frozen, their eyes darting between Isaiah and the men. No one said a word. Isaiah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could see the paths branching out in front of him, fight, flight, or something in between. He thought of his mother, of the countless times she'd told him to hold his head high, no matter what. He thought of his sergeant's voice in his ear, telling him to trust himself, and then he thought of the man he'd been before the war, the young kid who'd believed the world could be better, that people could change. That kid had been naive, but he hadn't been wrong to hope. Isaiah stood slowly, his full height dwarfing the wiry man and forcing the taller one to take a half-step back. The tension in the room crackled like a live wire. I'm not looking for trouble, Isaiah said again, his voice steady and measured. But I'm not afraid of it either. The wiry man's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. The taller man tightened his grip on the crowbar, his jaw clenching as he weighed his options. Before either of them could respond, the bell above the door jingled again, and a third figure stepped inside. She was tall and slender, with sharp features and piercing eyes that seemed to take in the entire room in a single glance. Her leather jacket and combat boots gave her an air of toughness, but there was something else about her, something that suggested she was used to being in control. The tension in the diner shifted the moment she entered. The group at the center. Table stiffened, and even the two men confronting Isaiah seemed momentarily thrown off balance. The woman's eyes landed on Isaiah, and for a brief moment, something like recognition flickered across her face. Then she turned to the taller man, her tone icy and commanding. What's going on here, Travis? The taller man, Travis, hesitated, the crowbar lowering slightly as he turned to face her. Nothing you need to worry about, Sam. Just a little conversation. Doesn't look like a conversation to me, Sam replied, her gaze hardening. It looks like you're trying to start something you can't finish. Travis bristled, but he didn't argue. The wiry man opened his mouth to speak, but Sam cut him off with a sharp glance. Don't, she said, her tone leaving no room for debate. Isaiah watched the exchange with cautious curiosity. Whoever this woman was, she clearly had some sway over these men, and while her sudden appearance added another layer of mystery to the situation, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of relief. Sam turned back to Isaiah, her expression unreadable. You okay? He nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure why. There was something about her presence that put him at ease, even if only slightly. Sam looked back at Travis and the wiry man, her voice dropping to a dangerous low. Leave. Now. Travis hesitated, his pride clearly warring with his better judgment, but after a long, tense moment he finally nodded. Let's go, he muttered, shoving the crowbar into his back pocket. The two men walked out, their footsteps heavy and reluctant. The group at the center table exchanged uneasy glances before hurriedly paying their bill and following them out. The diner was silent once more, the air still thick with the tension of what had almost happened. Sam turned back to Isaiah, her expression softening slightly. You sure you're okay? Isaiah nodded again, his voice quiet. Thanks. She studied him for a moment before nodding. Don't mention it. As she turned to leave, Isaiah couldn't help but wonder who she was and why she'd stepped in, and as the door closed behind her, he had a feeling this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. The storm had passed, for now. But Isaiah knew better than to think it was over. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Isaiah left the diner. He couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him, a heavy weight pressing on his back. The faces of Travis and his wiry companion haunted his thoughts, their smug, self-assured grins and the unspoken threat in their words. Sam's intervention had been timely, but he couldn't help wondering what it had cost her. People like Travis didn't take kindly to being embarrassed, especially not in front of an audience. Isaiah scanned his surroundings as he unlocked his truck, his military training kicking in instinctively. Every noise seemed sharper, every movement exaggerated in his mind. He didn't see anyone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. As he climbed into the cab, he thought about Sam. Who was she, and why had she stepped in? She'd diffused the situation with an ease that suggested familiarity with people like Travis, but her motives were unclear. Isaiah pulled out of the parking lot. Had she stepped in because she genuinely wanted to help? He drove aimlessly. Or was there something else at play? The hum of the engine doing little to quiet the storm inside him. The encounter at the diner had dredged up memories he'd worked hard to bury. Memories of places and people he'd left behind, of choices he'd made to survive. The desert heat was relentless, beating down on him as he ran through the obstacle course. His muscles screamed in protest, but he pushed on, driven by something deeper than pain. The drill sergeant's voice rang out behind him, sharp and unyielding. "You don't quit until I say so, Johnson. You hear me? You're not done until I say you're done." Isaiah had gritted his teeth, his mind a blur of determination and exhaustion. He wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but he was relentless. He'd learned that from his father, a man who'd worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. "You don't stop when you're tired," his father had said. "You stop when the job's done." It was a lesson that had carried Isaiah through the toughest moments of his life, through boot camp, through deployments, and through the long, lonely nights when the weight of the world seemed too much to dim. There. The blare of a car horn jolted Isaiah back to the present. He realized he'd been sitting at a green light, lost in thought. A wave of embarrassment washed over him as he hit the gas, the car behind him speeding past with an annoyed gesture. He decided to head home, though home felt like an overstatement. The small rental house on the edge of town was sparse and utilitarian, a far cry from the cozy family home he'd grown up in. But it was quiet, and that was what he needed. When he pulled into the driveway, the unease he'd felt earlier returned. The neighborhood was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He sat in the truck for a moment, scanning the street for anything out of place. The first sign of trouble came as he stepped out of the vehicle. His foot hit something slick, and he looked down to see a shattered glass bottle by his tire. The sour smell of alcohol filled the air and his heart sank. His eyes darted to the front door, where a crude message had been spray-painted across the wood. "Go back where you came from." Isaiah felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, hot and visceral. But beneath the anger was something colder, something that felt like fear, not for himself, but for what might come next. He walked to the door, his steps slow and deliberate. The message was a clear escalation, and he knew it wasn't random. This was a warning, a show of force meant to intimidate him. And it was working. Inside, the house was exactly as he'd left it, but it didn't feel the same. The walls seemed closer, the shadows darker. He double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, his pulse quickening as he did so. He knew he couldn't stay here forever. Travis and his crew wouldn't stop at a few threats and vandalism. They'd come back, and next time they wouldn't bother with subtlety. The following morning, Isaiah found himself at the hardware store, stocking up on supplies. He bought a new lock for the front door, a motion sensor light for the driveway, and a few other items that might give him some peace of mind. As he loaded the items into his truck, he noticed Sam leaning against a motorcycle in the far corner of the parking lot. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. "You planning on fortifying the place?" she asked as he approached. Her tone light but tinged with concern. Isaiah shrugged, just taking precautions. Sam nodded, her gaze steady. "Smart. You're gonna need it." Isaiah frowned. "You seem to know a lot about Travis and his friends." "They're predictable," Sam said. "Bullies usually are." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken questions. Isaiah wanted to ask why she'd stepped in at the diner, what her connection to Travis was, and why she seemed so invested in helping him. But before he could speak, Sam pushed off the motorcycle and handed him a slip of paper. "That's my number," she said. "If they come back, call me, and don't try to handle it alone." Isaiah hesitated before taking the paper. "Why are you helping me?" Sam's expression softened, and for a moment Isaiah thought he saw a flicker of something. Pain, regret, or maybe guilt. "Let's just say I've seen this kind of thing before, and I know how it ends if someone doesn't step in." She didn't wait for a response. With a nod, she climbed onto her motorcycle and sped off, leaving Isaiah standing in the parking lot with more questions than answers. The next few days were tense but uneventful. Isaiah kept his head down, going to work and returning home without incident, but the sense of unease never left him. Every noise outside, every unfamiliar face, set his nerves on edge. It wasn't until Friday night that the tension came to a head. Isaiah was sitting in his living room, the faint hum of the television filling the silence, when he heard it, a soft thud from the backyard. His heart pounded as he grabbed the baseball bat he'd kept by the door since the incident at the diner. He moved cautiously, his footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. The motion sensor light in the driveway had been triggered, casting long shadows across the yard. Isaiah stepped out onto the porch, his grip on the bat tightening as his eyes scanned the darkness. Then he saw it, a figure moving near the back fence, trying to stay hidden. "Hey!" Isaiah called out, his voice firm and steady. The figure froze for a moment before darting toward the side gate. Isaiah gave chase, his military training kicking in as he vaulted over the railing and landed in the yard. The figure was fast, but Isaiah was faster, and he caught up just as they reached the gate. He grabbed the intruder by the collar, yanking them back with enough force to send them sprawling onto the ground. It was the wiry man from the diner, his face twisted in anger and fear. "What the hell are you doing here?" Isaiah demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The man didn't answer, his eyes darting toward the gate as if calculating his chances of escape. Before Isaiah could press him further, a sharp whistle pierced the air. He turned to see Travis standing at the edge of the yard, the crowbar gleaming in his hand. "You don't learn, do you?" Travis said, his tone mocking. "We warned you. But I guess some people need a little more convincing." Isaiah's grip on the bat tightened as he turned to face Travis, the wiry man scrambling to his feet behind him. The two men closed in, and Isaiah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was outnumbered and outmatched, but he refused to back down. "Last chance," Travis said, his voice cold. "Walk away, or we'll make you." Isaiah didn't move. He stood his ground, his resolve hardening as he prepared for the inevitable. Yo, standoff stretched out, the tension crackling in the air like a live wire. And then, in the distance, came the faint sound of an engine, growing louder, closer. Someone was coming. The sound of the approaching engine cut through the tense night like a beacon, its steady growl growing louder by the second. Both Travis and his wiry companion froze, their heads snapping toward the driveway. Isaiah held his ground, his grip tightening on the bat as he braced for what was to come. The beam of a headlight swept across the yard as a sleek black motorcycle roared into view. The engine cut off, and the rider dismounted in one smooth motion. It was Sam. She removed her helmet, her face shadowed but unmistakable in the glow of the motion sensor light. Her presence was electric, her stance calm but commanding, like a storm brewing just below the surface. Travis sneered, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "What are you doing here, Sam?" he spat, trying to maintain his bravado. Sam didn't answer right away. She approached with measured steps, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. Her gaze flicked between Travis and his wiry sidekick before settling on Isaiah. "You okay?" she asked, her voice steady. Isaiah nodded, though his pulse was still racing. "I'm fine." Sam turned back to Travis, her expression hardening. "I warned you, Travis. I told you to leave him alone." Travis let out a bark of laughter, but it sounded forced. "Warned me? Since when do you care about someone like him?" Sam's jaw tightened, her fists clenching at her sides. "Since I decided I'm done watching you and your crew destroy everything you touch. This stops now." Isaiah watched the exchange, his mind racing to piece together the connection between Sam and Travis. It was clear there was history here, something personal that went far beyond the events of the diner. Travis took a step forward, the crowbar still in his hand. "And what are you going to do about it, huh? You think you can walk in here and play hero?" Sam smirked, but it wasn't a look of amusement. It was the kind of smirk that hinted at a deeper truth, one that she was about to unveil. "I don't need to play hero, Travis. You've already done most of the work for me." Isaiah saw the color drain from Travis's face, his bravado cracking as Sam pulled a small recording device from her pocket. She held it up for all to see, her thumb hovering over the play button. "You've been running your mouth for weeks, Travis," she said, "talking about your plans, bragging about what you and your buddies have been up to. You didn't think someone might be listening?" The tension in the air became suffocating as Sam pressed the button. A recording crackled to life, and Travis's voice spilled out loud and clear. "Ain't no way he's sticking around. We'll show him what happens when people like him don't know their place. Just like we did with the others. You remember that guy from the gas station?" "Yeah, same deal. We'll make sure he gets the message." Isaiah's stomach churned as the implications of the recording sank in. Travis had done this before. He wasn't just a loudmouth, he was dangerous. And now there was proof. Travis lunged for the device, his face contorted with rage. "You bitch! You think you can just—" Sam sidestepped him effortlessly, her movements quick and precise. She was unflinching, her confidence unshaken. "It's over, Travis," she said coldly. "I've already sent copies to the sheriff's office and a few reporters I trust. You're done." The wiry man took a step back, his eyes darting nervously between Travis and Sam. "I didn't sign up for this, man," he muttered, before turning and sprinting toward the fence. He vaulted over it and disappeared into the night, leaving Travis alone. Travis's grip on the crowbar tightened, his knuckles white. He looked at Isaiah, then back at Sam, as if trying to decide which of them he hated more. Finally, he dropped the crowbar with a clatter and raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he snarled. "You win this round, but don't think for a second that this is over." Sam took a step closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Oh, it's over, Travis. And if you ever come near Isaiah, or anyone else, again, I'll make sure the whole world knows exactly what kind of coward you are." Travis glared at her for a moment longer before turning and stalking off into the darkness. The sound of his retreating footsteps echoed in the still night, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. Isaiah exhaled slowly, his grip on the bat finally relaxing. He looked at Sam, his expression a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Why did you—" Sam sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's a long story," she said. "But let's just say I've been keeping tabs on Travis for a while. He's hurt a lot of people, Isaiah, people who didn't have anyone to stand up for them. I couldn't let him do it again." Isaiah studied her, searching for answers in her eyes. "Why do you care so much?" Sam hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. Because I've been on the other side of this, she admitted. I've seen what happens when people like Travis think they can get away with anything, and I've lost people because of it. Good people. Her voice broke slightly, and she took a deep breath, steadying herself. I couldn't stop it back then, but I can now. Isaiah felt a lump rise in his throat. He thought about all the times he'd faced injustice, all the times he'd been forced to swallow his pride and keep his head down to survive. And now, here was someone who had risked everything to stand up for him, a stranger who had become an ally. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words heavy with meaning. Sam nodded, a small, bittersweet smile playing at her lips. "Don't thank me yet. We've still got work to do." The next morning, Isaiah woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. It was a text from Sam. "Turn on the news." He grabbed the remote and switched on the TV, his heart pounding. The local news station was running a story about Travis and his crew, detailing their pattern of harassment and intimidation. The recording Sam had made was front and center, played on a loop for the entire town to hear. As the story unfolded, Isaiah felt a mix of emotions, relief, vindication, and a lingering sense of disbelief. For so long, he'd carried the weight of these experiences alone, convinced that no one would believe him or care enough to intervene. But now, the truth was out, and justice felt within reach. By the afternoon, news of Travis's actions had spread across town. People who had once ignored Isaiah or treated him with indifference now approached him with apologies and offers of support. It was overwhelming, but it also felt like a turning point, a chance to finally be seen and heard. Later that evening, Sam stopped by the house. She handed him a folder filled with documents and photos, evidence she'd gathered over the years. "This is everything I have on Travis and his crew," she said. "You might need it if they try to fight back." Isaiah looked at the folder, then back at Sam. "Why didn't you do this sooner?" he asked gently. Sam's expression grew somber. "Because I wasn't ready," she admitted. "I was scared. But meeting you, it reminded me why I started this in the first place. You gave me the courage to finish it." Isaiah felt a surge of emotion at her words. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone, that his fight was part of something bigger. As they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Isaiah realized that the battle wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more people like Travis who would try to tear him down, but now he had allies, and he had hope. And sometimes that was enough. In the days following the release of the recording, the town seemed to awaken from a long collective slumber. People who had once turned a blind eye to Travis's behavior could no longer feign ignorance. The recording was undeniable evidence of his malice, and the fallout was swift and decisive. The local sheriff held a press conference announcing that Travis and two of his closest associates had been arrested. Charges included harassment, intimidation, and assault, with investigations underway to uncover the full extent of their crimes. The news spread like wildfire, igniting conversations in coffee shops, schools, and workplaces. For Isaiah, the shift in the town's energy was palpable. People who had avoided making eye contact with him now offered friendly nods or stopped to chat. The diner, once a source of anxiety, became a place of cautious hope. Linda, the waitress who had hesitated to speak up before, approached him with a steaming cup of coffee one morning. "I should have done more," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, Isaiah." He looked at her, his heart heavy but understanding. "It's not just on you, Linda. We all let things slide for too long, but it's never too late to do the right thing." Her eyes welled up with tears, and she nodded. From that day forward, Linda became one of Isaiah's strongest allies, vowing to stand against any form of injustice she witnessed. As the days turned into weeks, Isaiah began to reflect on his journey. He thought about how far he'd come. Since the night at the diner, the fear and anger he'd felt, the temptation to lash out, and the strength it had taken to hold his ground. He also thought about the people who had stepped up, like Sam, whose courage had been the catalyst for change. One evening, as he sat on his porch, Sam joined him again, this time with a folder of new information. The town council is talking about setting up a community accountability board, she said, her tone hopeful. It's supposed to give people a platform to report discrimination and harassment. I think it's a good start. Isaiah nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. A good start, he echoed, but it's just that, a start. Change doesn't happen overnight. Sam leaned back in her chair, gazing at the horizon. You're right, but we've proven that it can happen, and that's enough to keep going. For Isaiah, those words carried weight. He had spent so much of his life feeling like change was impossible, like the forces stacked against him were too overwhelming to fight. But now he saw the cracks in the system, small openings where light could shine through. As for Travis, his downfall was swift and public. His friends abandoned him, unwilling to go down with him, as more of his past transgressions came to light. Stories surfaced of other victims who had suffered in silence for years, emboldened now to share their experiences. Travis's family, once proud of their local prominence, retreated into isolation, unable to face the shame his actions had brought upon them.